state of war.
Did the U.S. really save Europe?
We shall fight on the beaches.
The forces of Germany have surrendered.
Ladies and gentlemen, the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. It would be neither fitting nor efficacious for our government to undertake to draw up unilaterally a program designed to place Europe on its feet economically. This is the business of the Europeans. The initiative, I think, must come from Europe. The role of this country should consist of friendly aid.
For the last 80 years, American politicians have talked a big game about spreading democracy, freedom, and prosperity around the world. If you've watched our videos before, or you've lived through events like Afghanistan and Iraq, you probably already know that's not the most honest rhetoric our speechwriters have come up with. Most of the countries where the US has intervened, they don't usually do so hot after the US is done. But then again, there's Europe. Most countries in Europe are doing okay. It's not great, for sure. The fascist wave is definitely building there, living standards are trending down, and not every country is exactly in the same boat. But generally speaking, whether it's political institutions or standards of living, Europe is decently well off, especially in the Western countries. And for that, you can thank the Marshall Plan, the multi-billion-dollar aid program that the US just gave to Europe after World War II, selflessly rebuilding a continent that was completely flattened by an all-out war, and in the process, providing prosperity, democracy, and freedom for all. But is that what happened, though? Here's a statistic I want you to look at. In 1947, over 90% of the energy produced in Western Europe came from coal. Oil was nothing, less than 10% of the total energy bill, until 1960, when that number was already up to over 30%. Now, here's another statistic. Between 1947 and 1960, the same dates, the French Communist Party went from leading the National Assembly with over 160 seats to falling down to only 10. From first to basically last. And it turns out that the connection between these two statistics explains a lot about the US's strategy with Europe over the last 80 years. To make it simple, the Marshall Plan gave the US global veto power.
Addressing the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Secretary Marshall warns that failure of his plan means European collapse into...
I don't understand it. They were just trying to rebuild Europe, dude. Nothing to see here, just America being the magnanimous, good-willed nation that it is. Duh.
To a dictatorship of police states.
I urge the Congress to act promptly on this vital measure of our foreign policy, on this decisive contribution to world peace.
Under the cover of saving and redeveloping Europe, the Marshall Plan engineered complete dependency on the US and tore down the democratic checks and balances that Europe had been developing. It dismantled European organized labor, transformed the European economy into a funnel for profits back home, and set the stage for where we are today, with fascists knocking at the doors of power and socialists being too disorganized to provide a coherent alternative. If European standards of living seem pretty fragile nowadays, that's because European development was little more than a smokescreen for getting American oil companies to run the world without any resistance. The Marshall Plan didn't save Europe. The Marshall Plan destroyed it. Now, there are a few pieces to this puzzle. The first one is European coal. Like I said, Europe in the early 20th century was built on coal. After the Industrial Revolution kicked off, coal was not only widely available, it powered every factory, every office, every home, and every train. And because coal mattered so much to the rest of the European economy, it had an interesting side effect. It gave coal miners a lot of power. It turns out, trains carrying coal are pretty easy to derail. Managers also never go down in the mine, so coal extraction is easy to slow down and chalk it up to something the boss just doesn't know about. And if that doesn't work, a coal miner strike can easily trigger a general strike that ripples across a whole country when literally everyone in the country depends on this one thing. This would all be grossly undemocratic, except for the fact that coal production and distribution involved hundreds of thousands of people. Specifically, hundreds of thousands of unionized workers. And that mattered because coal unions were largely led by communists and communist parties. So even though European democracy was mostly only a thing for the elites, the very existence of communist-led coal unions gave normal workers a way not only to organize their workplace democratically, but then to take their ideas and actually force governments to listen to them. Coal workers could make sure that wages wouldn't be cut, hours wouldn't be extended, and the job wouldn't get more dangerous because they could threaten to shut everything.
I don't like this. It's just not enough free market principles being applied at the point of production. I hope they fix this
down, meaning they could enforce those things for themselves and push governments to recognize these rights for everyone, clawing back more and more of society into the hands of direct democratic control and raising living standards in the process, even if it made the boss and most politicians unhappy. Okay, tuck that little piece of information away for a second. Because the second piece of the puzzle was American oil companies. In the 1940s, these guys were worried. About 2/3 of global oil production was controlled solely by American corporations. But entire chunks of the world, like Europe, didn't need much of it. To make things worse, in 1947, oil prices just about doubled right at the same time all these countries were in a tough economic spot trying to recover from the war. They didn't have spare dollars just lying around to buy oil, which is fine because oil wasn't super important anyway, to them. But it made these oil tycoons worried. Big oil companies.
Yeah, Trump is obsessed with coal because he's secretly a Maoist third worldist and he wants the workers' councils to remain strong. He wants to bring them back. He knows that the true proletarian power comes from labor unions and labor union militancy. And we can only do that if we go back to an over-reliance on coal production, which he thinks happens as it did in like the fucking 19th century and not heavily automated as it is today.
Companies were scared because as all of this is spiraling down, they had no alternative to save themselves. They couldn't offset these trends by importing oil back home due to domestic laws that they had set up in the 30s to limit supply and keep their prices up. Bringing in more oil to the US would actually cut into their profits, and without Europe to pick up the slack, the future was looking bleak. The third piece of the puzzle was the American government. After World War II, the US was relatively unscathed, and its top priority became making sure that its companies would make as much money for the ruling class as possible. And this meant giving them as much access to as many markets in the world as possible. With the Soviet Union's influence growing, the US was worried that more and more countries just wouldn't be interested in trading with the US on their terms. Terms that made American companies more powerful in a context where they were already very well off, while everyone else was still licking their wounds. The US was concerned that this would push Europe down the communist path after the disaster that fascist capitalism had gotten them into. And so preventing the spread of communism suddenly became very important.
Once more, the world was reminded that basic in the idea of communism is the plan of world revolution, and that Russian communism has stepped beyond that plan to achieve world domination through aggression.
Finally, you had European politicians. Finding a way to rebuild Europe after the war was everyone's goal. But for the European ruling class, it was important that this would happen without the most popular bloc of the government, the communists. That same important year we keep coming back to, 1947, communists not only made massive gains in European parliaments like in France and Italy, but also organized some of these countries' largest strikes. In France, for example, 3 million workers organized by a communist union took to the streets after inflation went up about 60% and food rations were down to less than half a pound of bread per day. In a context like this, either a revolution was going to transform European politics and swing towards equality, or politicians would need to find another way to stay in power. Enter the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan swooped in with the promise of fixing all these problems for the ruling class. It would unite the interests of American oil companies and politicians on both sides of the Atlantic, and it would do so by screwing over the usual suspects, communists and workers. And this was pretty explicit. The future French Prime Minister Pierre Mendès-France put it this way: "The communists are rendering us a great service. Because we have a communist danger, the Americans are making a tremendous effort to help us. We must keep up this indispensable communist scare." But how? To kickstart the process, the Marshall Plan set a few conditions. First and foremost, European countries had to integrate their economies together in the European Steel and Coal Community, the organization that eventually became the European Union. The first step made sure that the coal industry would be less competitive, which made automation across the industry easier, and in the process, also completely destroyed coal workers' power. The number of coal workers was drastically cut, and union strikes suddenly no longer meant anything. Their power was gone now that all these countries were coordinating over their heads, and coal could be sent in by a neighbor if there was even a whiff of a dip in supply. So that's coal miners dealt with. Secondly, the US brought in new managers to train European workers writ large. The US was more productive than Europe at the time, and US ambassadors came in to promote the idea that this was because European workers were just too lazy and needed to be paid less, worked harder, and
Literally because they had more labor protections as opposed to America.
have their unions broken up. Communists were to be purged, and workers were to be trained in
This is the same meta with like the service industry. In Europe, adjusted to their own individual economies, the service sector jobs they have reliable pay, right? Your pay is not determined by your performance because it's not tip based. And therefore, Americans will always complain about how fucking lazy European service is, like how bad service is in Europe, not realizing that they themselves are also workers in America.
the American way. This was all, of course, a lie. American output was higher not because of any unique American management techniques, but because the US just had more fuel per worker. But this didn't matter. Part of the Marshall Plan's propaganda, led by the specially created Information Division, included getting managers in countries like the UK to think that the most important thing they could achieve was higher productivity, and that communists and unionists were the only thing standing in the way. This would increase imports to the US and generally was pretty good for European capitalists too. More important than those two changes, though, was what happened with oil. After getting rid of the communists, the rest of this racket hinged on filling the power vacuum by getting Europeans hooked on American oil. And the way they did this was pretty obvious. Out of the $13 billion that were part of the Marshall Plan, $1.2 billion was earmarked exclusively for the European purchase of American oil. France, Italy, and the UK, countries where coal and communists were the largest barrier to American corporate interests, got the bulk of this aid that went.
Chinese Richie Torres. I don't like the things you say about Israel. I think you should stop. I'm coming for your seat, Richie.
Right back into American pockets. With some of the rest of these funds, entire industries were converted to be run on oil, not coal. And it was made very clear in the conditions of this deal that this oil was not to be owned or refined by Europe itself. To give you an idea, of all the billions spent on converting Europe to oil power, European countries were only given a paltry $24 million to start their own oil refineries. That didn't stop Europe entirely, but the point was to make sure that regardless, Europe would always need the US and its oil companies to survive. In other words, much of this aid sent to Europe made a short trip abroad and then returned immediately to the hands of US oligarchs. And this all made European democracy a lot weaker. Not only could Europe no longer really stand to contradict the US, who had their hand on the oil tap, the unions never recovered. Unlike coal, the oil industry is much harder to unionize. For starters, the oil wasn't even being pulled in Europe. It was coming in from the Middle East on ships, meaning there were no more train tracks and no more derailments. If it wasn't ships, oil was traveling by pipeline. and its journey now involved far fewer people loading and unloading it from one checkpoint to another, meaning fewer opportunities for workers to block the flow. And if workers blew up one of these pipelines, it turned out that those were much easier to fix than railroads. And that's not all. Oil extraction also requires fewer workers, who were almost exclusively working on the surface right next to their managers, meaning they had fewer opportunities to organize and get in their way. All of this combined meant that where once European energy required the consent of hundreds of thousands of people all working together, hundreds of thousands of people who needed to be kept happy with reasonable wages and chances to express their political preferences, oil promised to stamp all that out.
Bro, I thought this was about NATO. This didn't even scratch the surface. This is like a basic introduction.
Thanks to oil and the fact that it's much harder for workers to control, all that mattered was keeping a handful of American businessmen happy. And getting there by buying off politicians with massive aid packages was easy. The point is, the picture of Europe you're left with after the Marshall Plan is very different from what it could have been. Living standards went up, and the recovery after the war took relatively little time given just how destroyed much of these countries were. But Europe was rebuilt on shaky foundations. Foundations that required them to sacrifice genuine democracy and leave themselves vulnerable to American oil interests and whoever's ear they have at any given time. Today, with the US going its own way and unions neutered to the point of impotence, the European fascist movement has an open field to conquer. And for that, you can thank the Marshall Plan.